The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar melody as Mariana Costa wiped down the last of the nail stations at Bella Nail's salon. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and the usual chaos of the day had finally dissolved into silence. Her feet ached, a dull throb that started in her arches and radiated upward through her calves. She'd been standing for 12 hours straight, painting nails, listening to gossip, breathing in the chemical tang of acetone and polish remover that had become as familiar to her as the scent of her own apartment. Mariana had arrived in New York 3 years ago from São Paulo, Brazil, carrying 2 suitcases and a dream of independence. Her parents had wanted her to stay, to work in her uncle's accounting firm, to take the safe path that generations of her family had chosen. But Mariana had always been different. She saw beauty in small things, in the transformation of hands, in the confidence that bloomed across a woman's face when she looked down at freshly manicured nails. There was something about that work, something deeply human, that made her feel like she was offering more than just a cosmetic service. She was offering a moment of self-care in a world that demanded too much and gave too little. The salon itself was modest but meticulously maintained. Rosa, the owner, had built this place with her own hands over 20 years, turning a cramped storefront into a sanctuary for women across the neighborhood. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and small framed photographs of satisfied clients covered one corner, a visual testimony to Rosa's artistry and Mariana's growing reputation. The younger girls at the salon had started requesting Mariana specifically, seeking out her gentle touch and her ability to suggest designs that actually suited their hands, rather than following whatever trend was currently viral on TikTok. Tonight, Rosa had left early at 7 o'clock. Her daughter was having trouble in school, and Rosa needed to attend a parent-teacher conference. She'd hesitated before leaving, asking Mariana twice if she minded closing up alone. The salon was in a relatively safe neighborhood, relatively being the operative word in a city where safe was always a negotiable concept. But Rosa had asked, and Mariana had assured her it was fine. She often volunteered for the closing shift, finding something almost meditative about the routine of tidying, restocking, and preparing the space for the next day. Now, as the minutes ticked past 10 o'clock, Mariana moved through the salon with the muscle memory of ritual. She swept the floor around each station, collecting wisps of cuticle skin and the occasional broken nail tip that had fallen during the day. She wiped down the pedicure chairs, emptying the foot basins and rinsing them with hot water until the porcelain gleamed. She organized the Polish bottles by color, reds and pinks on one shelf, nudes and nudes on another, the deeper colors arranged like a sunset at the far end. The back room, where they kept supplies and took their short breaks, was particularly cluttered tonight. Mariana loaded a cart with empty polish bottles destined for recycling, with used wipes and trash. She was reaching for a stack of clean towels when she heard it, the sound of the front door opening. She froze. The magnetic lock on the front door chimed whenever someone entered, a soft electronic chirp that Rosa had installed years ago. It was a security measure of sorts, though not a particularly effective one. Mariana glanced at the clock. 10:14 p.m. The salon had closed at 9. Who would be coming in now? She pushed the cart aside and walked toward the front of the salon, her mind already forming reasonable explanations. Perhaps Rosa had forgotten something. Perhaps a client had left a purse or a phone. The city was full of small emergencies, the kinds that disrupted carefully planned evenings. What she saw when she emerged from the back room stopped her heart. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the sodium glow of the street lamps outside. He was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His features were obscured by shadow, but Mariana could make out the general shape of him, the cut of his jacket, the careful arrangement of his dark hair. For a moment, he simply stood there, one hand still on the door he'd just opened. Then she heard the sound of the lock engaging behind him. "We're closed," Mariana called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "We close at 9. You can come back tomorrow morning." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, deeper into the salon. The fluorescent light caught his face now, and Mariana saw that he was perhaps 40, maybe older. It was difficult to tell. His features were sharp, almost severe, with dark eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. There was something wrong about those eyes, something that sent a primal warning signal racing through her nervous system. "We're closed," she repeated, reaching for her phone on the counter. It lay in plain sight, just where she'd left it when she'd finished scrolling through her break. "I'm going to call—" "Don't," the man said. His voice was slurred, the word dragging slightly. He was drunk. Mariana could see it now. The slight sway as he moved, the careful deliberation of someone trying to maintain control and failing. "Don't you call anyone." He took another step closer. The fear that had been building in Mariana's chest suddenly crystallized into something sharp and immediate. Her body recognized the danger before her mind had fully caught up. Every nerve ending in her system began to scream. She thought about Rosa, about her 2 children at home. She thought about her parents in São Paulo, about the promise she'd made to herself when she came to America to be careful, to stay safe, to never take unnecessary risks. This was an unnecessary risk. She was alone, in a salon with no panic button, with a locked door between her and the street, with a drunk man who was now backing her slowly toward the corner of the room. "I have money," Mariana said quickly. "There's cash in the register. You can take it. Just take it and—" "I don't want your money," the man said. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried something far more threatening than a shout, something that spoke of intentions that had nothing to do with robbery. "I've had a very bad day, and I saw you through the window, saw you bending over like that, saw how pretty you are when you're not thinking about anything but your work." He reached out, and his hand, large and trembling with either rage or intoxication or both, caught the edge of her sleeve. Mariana could see the dirt under his fingernails, could smell the whiskey and cigarettes on his breath. He was close enough now that she could see every pore on his face, every capillary that had burst across his nose from years of drinking. Every instinct in her body told her to scream. But there was another instinct that kicked in at the same moment, pure animal survival. He was stronger, and he had his hands on her, and he was blocking the path to the back room where she'd left her purse, her keys, her phone. The only escape route was forward toward the front door. Mariana yanked her sleeve with all the force her adrenaline could muster. The fabric tore with a sharp rip, and the sudden resistance threw the man off balance for just a fraction of a second. Barely enough time, barely enough space. But it was enough. She bolted. Her feet carried her past him toward the front door. She fumbled with the lock, and it seemed to take forever. An eternity of precious seconds while he recovered from his surprise and began to move after her. The lock finally disengaged with a soft click, and the door swung open to the cool night air of Manhattan. And then Mariana did something she didn't know she was capable of. She ran barefoot into the street, screaming. The pavement was rough against Mariana's feet, uneven concrete interspersed with patches of asphalt that had been repeatedly filled in and cracked again. There were broken bits of gravel that dug into her soles, and she could feel the warmth of blood mixing with sweat between her toes. But the pain registered as distant, unimportant, secondary to the primal need to put distance between herself and the man behind her. She screamed as she ran, a sound that tore from somewhere deep in her chest, something between a shriek and a sob. It was a sound that had been shaped by evolution to trigger a response in other humans, a call for help that transcended language, that accessed something ancient and instinctive. "Help!" she cried into the night. "Someone help me! Please!" The Lower East Side at night has a peculiar quality to it. It's not empty. There are people everywhere, on stoops and outside late-night bodegas, in bars and restaurants that cater to night shift workers and insomniacs, and those for whom the daylight hours had never quite existed. But there's also a kind of studied indifference that pervades the neighborhood, a willingness to look away from things that don't directly concern you, to assume that if something terrible is happening, someone else will handle it, or perhaps more accurately, a learned caution. In a city of 8 million people, you learn quickly that getting involved can be dangerous. You learn that helping a stranger might mean becoming entangled in their crisis, might mean being called as a witness, might mean becoming a victim yourself. So you develop a filter, a way of tuning out the chaos, of seeing without actually observing. Mariana ran past a couple standing outside a corner bodega, their attention focused on the cellophane-wrapped sandwiches in the window. The woman glanced up as Mariana flew past, her ripped sleeve fluttering like a flag of surrender, her face a portrait of absolute terror. For a moment, just a moment, their eyes connected. The woman saw her, truly saw her. And then, as if making a conscious decision, the woman looked away. She turned back to her companion, saying something that made him laugh, adjusting his attention to the plastic-covered food rather than the barefoot woman bleeding down the sidewalk. Mariana kept running. A taxi was crawling slowly down the avenue, its driver searching for a fare or perhaps simply trying to pass the time of a slow evening. She ran directly at the cab, waving her arms, screaming. The driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. For a second she thought he would stop. For a second she believed that salvation was just a few feet away. But then she saw something shift in his expression, a calculation, a risk assessment, and he sped up, pulling away from her, accelerating until he merged into traffic and disappeared. 3 more cars passed her. A delivery cyclist swerved around her without slowing. An older woman exiting a restaurant with her shopping bags adjusted her course by a few inches to avoid collision, but didn't look up from her phone. The world was full of people, and Mariana was completely alone. Behind her she could hear him. The man from the salon had followed her out into the street. His footsteps were heavy and uncoordinated, the shuffling run of someone whose balance was compromised by alcohol, but whose determination was absolute. He wasn't as fast as her, but he didn't have to be. This was his block. He knew the geography. And more importantly, he knew that she was getting tired. Mariana's lungs were beginning to burn. Her bare feet were sending signals of pain that her adrenaline could no longer entirely suppress. She was starting to slow down, just fractionally, but enough that she could feel the gap between them narrowing. She was going to get caught. The realization hit her with the force of certainty. She was going to get caught, and no one was going to help her, and whatever happened next would happen in a world that had already demonstrated its indifference. The thought lasted only a second. Then, from the direction of the avenue ahead, there came a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the city, the sharp, violent shriek of tires on asphalt. The matte black car didn't gradually slow down. It didn't brake with any sense of proportion or predictability. Instead, it screeched to a halt with a violence that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The tires, expensive and well-maintained, nonetheless produced a sound like a wounded animal, a screaming protest against the sudden application of forces they weren't designed to withstand. Smoke rose from the wheels in thin grey streams, and when the car finally stopped, it was positioned directly in front of Mariana's path, cutting off her flight with the finality of a wall. The driver's side door opened before the car had fully settled. What emerged was a man unlike anyone Mariana had ever seen in person, though she'd certainly heard about men like him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested both natural physical capability and careful maintenance through discipline rather than casual gym visits. His suit was charcoal grey, impeccably tailored, and it cost more than Mariana made in a month. His hair was dark, slicked back with expensive product, and his face was arranged into an expression of complete and utter calm, which was somehow far more terrifying than any expression of anger could have been. But it was his eyes that struck Mariana most forcefully. They were dark brown, nearly black, and they carried the kind of weight that came from seeing things that most people never witnessed. There was intelligence there, and control, and something else that Mariana's primitive brain recognized as danger. Pure, untamed danger held in check by nothing but the force of sheer will. The man's gaze swept across the scene in front of him. Mariana in her torn uniform, bleeding from her feet and from where her sleeve had ripped, her face flushed with terror and exertion. Then his eyes moved past her, to the man who had been chasing her. The drunk was slowing down now, perhaps recognizing the change in the calculus of the situation. Something unspoken passed between the two men. It was like watching a predator recognize a territory marker, the subtle acknowledgement of a hierarchy in which one occupied a place far above the other. The man in the suit took one step forward, positioning himself between Mariana and her attacker. He didn't say anything. He simply existed in that space, blocking the path with the immovable certainty of a man who had never in his life questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. "Sir," the drunk began, his voice suddenly devoid of its earlier confidence, "I don't want any trouble." The man in the suit didn't respond. He simply looked at him, and the weight of that gaze was enough to make the drunk take a step backward. I was just... The drunk's words were beginning to tumble over each other in his desperation to create distance from this new player in the drama. "I didn't mean..." The man in the suit turned his head slightly, not turning his body, just his head, to look back at the salon. When his eyes moved, the drunk bolted, not toward the avenue but toward the back, toward the alley that ran behind the block. He ran with the desperation of someone who'd suddenly recognized how far above his pay grade this situation had escalated. The man in the suit watched him go for exactly 2 seconds, calculating distances and angles and the likelihood of pursuit. Then, apparently satisfied that the threat had neutralized itself, he turned his attention back to Mariana. She was still standing in the street, her body paralyzed by shock and the strange transition from mortal terror to sudden, inexplicable safety. Her feet were bleeding, her sleeve was torn, her heart was hammering in her chest at a rate that seemed medically unsustainable. And yet she was alive, unmolested, and standing in front of a man who had intervened in her crisis without hesitation. The man reached into his jacket, a motion that made Mariana flinch slightly, and withdrew a handkerchief. It was white, pristine, clearly expensive. He held it out to her, waiting for her to understand. When she did, she took it with shaking hands and held it against the bleeding gash on her wrist, where the drunk's fingers had dug in hard enough to break the skin. Then, with the gentleness of someone who had no need to perform gentleness but chose to offer it anyway, he removed his own jacket. It was warm from his body, and it carried the scent of expensive cologne and clean linen. He draped it over her shoulders. "Come," he said, and the single word was imbued with such absolute authority that Mariana's feet began moving without consulting her conscious mind. He guided her back toward the salon. The drunk hadn't locked it when he'd fled. The door was still standing open, the sanctuary of the small business suddenly feeling very vulnerable. But the man in the suit seemed unperturbed. He walked her inside, guided her past the nail stations, toward the back room where Mariana had been tidying when the evening had transformed from routine into nightmare. He positioned her gently in one of the comfortable waiting chairs and retrieved her phone from the counter. When he handed it to her, the gesture was almost courtly. He waited, standing at a respectful distance, while she made the decision about what to do next. It took Mariana a long moment to understand that she was being offered a choice. She could call the police if she wanted to, or she could handle this differently. The man's presence communicated this with perfect clarity, without a word being spoken. After several seconds, Mariana began to tremble, not from fear anymore, but from the release of tension, from the shock of adrenaline leaving her system, from the awful realization of what had almost happened and didn't. Her hands shook as she held the phone. The man watched her with an expression that suggested he'd witnessed this particular kind of breakdown many times before. He waited until her breathing had stabilized before speaking. "Your name," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mariana," she managed. "Mariana Costa." He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away in some internal archive. "Mariana Costa," he repeated, and the way he said her name made it sound like a commitment, like an addition to a ledger of people who were now under his personal protection. "You'll need to have someone look at those feet." She looked down at them, as if seeing them for the first time. The blood had stopped flowing, but her soles were a landscape of minor lacerations and embedded gravel. They hurt now that the emergency had passed, hurt in a way that suggested they would hurt considerably more in the morning. "Thank you," Mariana whispered. "Thank you for—" "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't—" He raised a hand, and the gesture silenced her. Not unkindly, but with the weight of someone who was unaccustomed to hearing gratitude, as if gratitude was something he'd decided long ago was beneath his notice. "No one hurts women in my streets," he said. There was no pride in the statement, no sense of him seeking acknowledgement for this philosophy. He was simply stating a fact, the way one might describe a physical law. No one takes advantage of anyone who belongs here. That's how it works. He moved toward the door, and Mariana understood that he was preparing to leave. She had 1,000 questions. Who was he? How had he known to turn down that particular street at exactly that moment? Would the drunk come back? Would she be safe here anymore? But she suspected that asking them would be a waste of breath. Some information, she understood, would be provided on a need-to-know basis. And she had just been upgraded from doesn't need to know to something slightly higher in the hierarchy. At the doorway he paused. "Don't go home tonight," he said. "Stay with someone. The man who attacked you, he'll be dealt with. But sometimes there are consequences to these things, and sometimes those consequences move in unpredictable ways. It's better for you if you're not alone tonight, or if you're not alone at home anyway." Then he was gone, back toward his matte black car, which was still idling on the street outside the salon, a monument to sudden, extraordinary intervention. Mariana stood very still for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She was still alive. She was still safe. The danger had passed. But in the space where her fear had resided, a new emotion had begun to take root. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complicated. Something that felt like debt and obligation, and the awareness of having been drawn into a story much larger than her own. She called Rosa. She called her friend Diana. She told them what had happened, listening to their shrieks of horror and their insistence that she should have called the police, should have done something more immediately, should have. But underneath their recriminations, underneath her own shock, Mariana kept thinking about the man with the dark eyes and the tailored suit. She kept thinking about how quickly he'd positioned himself between her and danger, how casually he'd stepped out of that car, as if the rules that bound the rest of the world didn't quite apply to him. She kept thinking about his name, which she still didn't know. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood. Not through social media or messaging apps, but through the older channels, the networks of observation and gossip that existed in the spaces between legitimate commerce and the underground economy that had been operating in that same territory for decades. By the next morning, everyone who mattered knew what had happened at Bella Nail's salon. The story took on the quality of mythology. A young woman, alone, attacked by a predator, a sudden intervention by someone who appeared out of nowhere to stop it. But what made the story remarkable, what made it spread from one block to the next, from one social circle to another, was the identity of the man who had stopped his car. His name was Nico Santori. He was the most feared Mafia boss in the district, a man whose territory encompassed 17 blocks of the Lower East Side and extended upward into parts of Midtown Manhattan. He was someone whose name was usually only whispered, and usually in contexts where immediate danger was not a concern. A man whose business interests were so carefully compartmentalized that no one person could ever have enough information to bring him down. A man who, by all reliable accounts, had not personally intervened in a street-level situation in approximately 7 years, until Mariana. The story became legendary in the neighborhood with remarkable speed. It transformed Mariana from the new girl at Bella Nails into the girl who made Nico Santori stop his car. Older women who came into the salon to get their hair washed and their gossip exchanged for the price of a manicure looked at her with something that might have been respect, might have been fear, might have been a combination of both. The man who had attacked her, a small-time criminal named Vincent Russo, disappeared from the neighborhood within 48 hours. He didn't go to the police. He didn't file a complaint. He simply ceased to exist in any visible capacity, and the prevailing wisdom was that he'd decided the smarter option was to find a different city, a different neighborhood, a different life, where he wasn't marked as someone who'd crossed Nico Santori over something as stupid as an attempted sexual assault on a manicurist. Mariana returned to work 3 days after the attack, her feet still tender, but no longer actively bleeding. Rosa had wanted to give her a week off, but Mariana had declined. She understood something in the aftermath that hadn't been clear before, that the attack had happened not because the salon was dangerous, but because she had been alone. The solution wasn't to hide or retreat, but to re-establish her presence, to reclaim the space, to demonstrate to herself and to the universe that one bad evening wasn't going to derail her life. But everything had changed, and she knew it. The way customers looked at her was different. The way Rosa spoke to her was different. There was a new layer of meaning attached to her presence, and it wasn't always comfortable. 2 weeks after the attack, a car pulled up outside the salon while Mariana was finishing a client's nails. It was matte black, expensive, and very familiar. Rosa, who had been sorting through inventory in the back room, emerged immediately, her professional composure temporarily fractured by panic. But it wasn't Nico Santori who emerged from the car. It was a younger man, perhaps 30, with sharp features and the bearing of someone who was used to being obeyed. He was impeccably dressed, and his eyes were kind in a way that suggested he'd learned kindness as a skill to be deployed strategically. He entered the salon with the ease of someone who knew he belonged there. He approached Mariana, and she set down her brush with hands that were steadier than she'd expected them to be. "Mr. Santori wanted me to check on you," the man said. His accent was Italian, New York-educated Italian. "He wanted to know how you're doing. He wanted to know if you need anything." Mariana's brain scrambled to process this. I'm fine," she said. "Tell him I'm fine. Tell him thank you." The man nodded, as if this response had been pre-approved. "Mr. Santori also wanted you to know that you have nothing to worry about. That situation has been handled, and that if anyone at all, ever gives you trouble in this neighborhood, you should call this number." He placed a card on the nail station. It was elegant, expensive stock, with nothing on it but a phone number. "Mr. Santori takes care of his people," the man continued, "and you're his people now. That's just how it works." Then he was gone, back to the car, back to wherever people like him existed, in the spaces between the legitimate and the criminal underworld. Mariana picked up the card with trembling fingers. The phone number was imprinted in raised letters, the kind of thing that suggested significant investment in professional quality. She turned it over, looking for some hidden message or explanation, but there was nothing, just the number and the weight of implied obligation. Rosa appeared at her side, her normally composed expression now somewhere between fear and confusion. "What just happened?" Rosa asked quietly. "I don't know," Mariana replied, and it was true. She didn't know exactly what had happened, or what it meant, or what it was going to mean going forward. What she did know was that her life had been split into two parts now, before the attack and after. Before the attack, she'd been just another young Brazilian woman working in a nail salon in Manhattan, doing the job well, collecting her paycheck, building her savings. After the attack, she'd become something else. She'd become someone who had caught the attention of the most dangerous man in her neighborhood, and who had been deemed worthy of his intervention. Over the following weeks and months, Mariana began to understand the implications of this. She understood it through the way other businesses in the neighborhood suddenly seemed to respect the salon more. She understood it through the absence of the petty crimes that had previously plagued the area, the smash-and-grab robberies, the muggings, the small violences that had been as much a part of the neighborhood's ecosystem as pigeons and potholes. She understood it through the way that customers started coming to the salon, not just because Rosa was good, but because the place had been blessed by proximity to Nico Santori's protection. 6 months after the attack, Mariana received an indirect message through one of her regular clients, a woman married to someone who worked in one of Santori's legitimate businesses. The message was that if Mariana ever needed anything, she should reach out to the phone number on the card. If her family ever needed anything, if she ever wanted to move to a better apartment or send money home to São Paulo, or needed help navigating the complicated bureaucracy of immigration and permanent residence, there were people who could facilitate these things. Mariana didn't call, not because she wasn't tempted. The offer was extraordinary, the kind of opportunity that could fundamentally change her life, but because she understood that calling would come with costs, with debts that would continue to accrue, with an ongoing relationship to someone who operated in a moral universe that was adjacent to her own, but not quite contained within it. Instead, she worked. She saved. She continued to excel at her craft, building a reputation as one of the best nail technicians on the Lower East Side. She took Rosa into her confidence about her immigration status, and together they navigated the legal pathways to permanent residence. She sent money to her parents, wrote them letters explaining that America was treating her well, that she'd had some difficulties but had overcome them, that she was happy. She didn't tell them about Nico Santori. She didn't tell them that she'd been attacked or saved or claimed as someone's responsibility. These were American experiences, she felt, that wouldn't translate well into Portuguese or into the worldview of her parents, who had left her not to become entangled with criminals, but to build a legitimate life in a new country. And slowly, as weeks turned into months and months into years, Mariana developed a kind of peace about what had happened. The attack itself faded into something that had occurred to someone who was almost a different person, younger, more vulnerable, more naive about the ways that cities could contain both cruelty and unexpected mercy in their same concrete streets. She understood now that some debts were paid not by action, but by existence. That Nico Santori had intervened on that street not because he'd expected something in return, but because he'd established a code for himself, that certain things weren't tolerated in his territory, that women shouldn't be hunted, that a barefoot girl screaming for help shouldn't be ignored while cars drove past and people turned away. Whether he'd always been this way, or whether something in his past had crystallized this particular philosophy, Mariana never learned. But she understood that in a city full of people who looked away, who protected their own interest above all other considerations, there could sometimes be someone who stopped his car, someone for whom the sight of terror in a stranger's eyes was enough to override all other priorities. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after the attack, Mariana was closing the salon when she glanced out the window and saw the matte black car parked across the street. For a moment, her heart rate accelerated, and all of the fear from that terrible night came rushing back in concentrated form. But then the car simply drove away, moving slowly down the avenue and disappearing into traffic. She never knew if Nico Santori had been inside it, checking on her the way he'd had his associate check on her 2 years before. She never knew if it had been some elaborate coincidence, or if her presence in the neighborhood continued to be monitored, observed, taken into account by someone who lived in the spaces between the visible and the invisible. But she understood that the attack had changed something fundamental in her life. It had introduced her to a city that contained not just cruelty, but also unexpected grace. It had shown her that sometimes salvation arrives in a matte black car, driven by someone whom the world had decided to fear. And it had taught her something else, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. That in a city of 8 million people, where so many suffered through their invisible crises alone, sometimes there were people who chose to notice. Sometimes there were people who stopped their cars. If the resilience of Mariana Costa's story touched your heart, if you found yourself thinking about how one moment of unexpected mercy can reshape an entire life, then we invite you to join us on this channel. Subscribe now to follow more extraordinary stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Stories of survival, of courage, of the moments when humanity shines through the darkness of urban life. These are the narratives that remind us why we keep going, why we keep hoping, why we remain vulnerable enough to believe that kindness still exists in a complicated world. New stories arrive every week. Stories from different cities, different countries, different lives, but all connected by the universal experience of being human in a world that often demands too much and offers too little. Subscribe, be part of this community, and together, let's celebrate the stories that make us believe in the possibility of grace.